Hello, I'm Siri Vaith, Executive Director of Cystic Fibrosis Research Incorporated, CFRI, and I am happy to welcome you to this 8th question and answer session with Dr. Rick Moss. As many of you already know, Dr. Moss is a preeminent CF clinician and researcher, former director of the CF Center at Stanford, and also a board member of CFRI, quite fortunately for us. Before we get started, I do want to remind you that no information shared today should be used for your own diagnosis or care. If you have any questions, please do contact your care provider. And finally, I do want to stress that today is May 20th. And as always, that date is important because information changes so rapidly. So if you're watching this, the information contained herein is valid as of today, May 20th. So with that, I welcome you, Dr. Moss.
Hello again.
So we will start with our usual beginning question, which is the current update for the number of cases and deaths due to COVID-19 in the US and the world.
So the world identified case count is coming very close to 5 million around the world. And of those, 322,000 deaths in the United States were over 1.5 million at this point, and over 90,000 deaths. At the current rate, I'm pretty sure we'll be over 100,000 deaths by the end of the month, if not next week. Wow. So we seem to be on a plateau nationally, and it's a very variable picture based on region, city, county. So it's almost it has some value to look at the national figure, but the real value is to look at what's local. And I think that really is a much better indication, because then you can see how many new cases there are, how many hospitalizations, how many deaths. And if that's done over time, then you can get a real trend as to whether that particular region is decreasing. And remember that the basic CDC guideline, and it is basic because the more complex guidelines have not been released, but the basic one is to make sure things are improving for 2 weeks before you proceed to open up more businesses and so on. So looking locally is really important.
And do you have any updates regarding recent reports of COVID-19 cases in the CF community?
Yeah, the most frequent information is coming out from this consortium in Europe through the European CF Society called CF Europe. They get reporting from 32 countries. They've actually invited more countries, but they've actually got data from 32. And 10 countries have reported cases to the ECFS, 59 cases in that region of the world. And 13 of those being pediatric cases, 18 having diabetes, 32 hospitalizations, 6 ICU cases, 2 on a ventilator, 8 transplant cases. They've only had 1 death so far in that group. And interestingly, 11 of the cases have been asymptomatic. If you look at the baseline status, the largest subgroup are those with pretty well-preserved lung function, FEV1 over 70%. 20 of the cases were in that category. So it occurs across a wide spectrum of patients. And the number of cases suggests, as we mentioned before, that people with CF are doing a good job at the social isolation and distancing measures to avoid getting infected, because these are low numbers. In the United States, again, the CFF is reporting weekly to care providers, and has a small number of cases, 2 deaths reported in the US. A very similar picture. Again, overrepresentation from transplant recipients, which clearly is a risk factor within the CF population, possibly diabetes being the other one.
I don't know this number, the percentage of people with CF who are post-transplant in terms of percentage of the total, do you?
It's got to be a small number because only a couple hundred cases are done a year in the United States as a whole. And that's includes CF, but it extends beyond it. So I think the number of CF cases is pretty small overall.
So that really does show the disproportionate amount for the cases.
When you see it as a proportion of the reported COVID cases, it does appear to be overrepresented, I think. And that makes us a lot of sense in terms of the immunosuppression that patients have to take.
And do we know the asymptomatic cases? I don't know how much they've drilled down in that report. Were they more likely to be pediatric cases?
They didn't give the age of symptomatic versus asymptomatic, but the fact that the majority of these people are adults, and only 13 out of the 59 in Europe were below the age of 18, suggests that likely those are asymptomatic, mostly asymptomatic cases. The other thing is, so far, I haven't heard of any cases of this new inflammatory syndrome that's being seen in pediatric COVID cases. That seems to be a small number so far. It's worrisome because it's a whole new aspect of this disease. But so far as I know, no CF cases in that Kawasaki-like syndrome that's now on people's radar.
Absolutely. It's unbelievable, just the longer and longer list of complications to this. Each week there's something else. We have a question. I tested positive for COVID-19 at National Jewish. I only had headaches and loss of taste. Otherwise, I was asymptomatic. I had my first retest a week later, and it is negative. My question is, since I'm on Xolair shots, an immunosuppressant, can I get an antibody test 3 weeks from negative result, or would it be skewed? If I temporarily stop them, would that help in getting accurate antibody tests? And this person added, my facility uses the ELISA test, ELISA test.
Right. Well, it's a very specific question. The number of people with CF that are on Xolair is relatively small. It's really indicated for only a subset of people that have allergic bronchopulmonary aspergillosis who are having trouble with other treatments like steroids and antifungals. But Xolair itself is not immunosuppressive per se. It really is very targeted to one particular kind of immune protein called allergic antibody, or IgE. And to my knowledge, it doesn't really immunosuppress broadly. So it shouldn't be a problem in terms of detecting an antibody response to COVID. Of course, waiting until before your next dose of Xolair will improve the chances of any interference, but I think those are very low. So I think this person could go ahead and get tested 3 weeks from the negative result and would probably be valid. Actually, a more germane question is, what kind of antibody test are they using? The questioner states that the facility uses an ELISA test, which is one of the more accurate methodologies. There's 3 different ways to look at antibodies. It gets complicated. And a lot of the kits that are available use another method called lateral flow assay, which is generally not as accurate as the ELISA test. So that's good they're using an ELISA test, but we don't know which one. I would urge anyone who's getting an antibody test to try and find out which test is being used. What's the method? Is it a lateral flow assay? Is it an ELISA? Only research facilities are doing what's called a neutralization test, which involves cells and culture, much more complicated. So the ELISAs, I think, are the preferred test at this point in general. The area is something that is a real Wild West situation now, with over 200 of antibody tests being marketed now. The FDA allows that. They've authorized under the emergency use authorization 11 different procedures or kits. That doesn't mean that they've tested them for accuracy. So we're still waiting to hear from a joint project between the FDA, the CDC, and the NIH to validate antibody assays in general. And the few studies that have come out so far have suggested that these assays can be have overall accuracy between 80 and 100%. So it can 100%, of course, is great. 80% is completely worthless. So you have to really check that out and know a little bit about which particular assay is being used. But I would suspect at National Jewish or elsewhere in Denver, they probably have a pretty well established and good test available. So I think that the person can get tested. The Xolair should not interfere, and hopefully the ELISA will be accurate.
And I don't know if that person knows that they are asking like one of the international experts in fungal infections. So whoever asked that question, you asked the right person. So just staying on the topic of antibody testing, I actually spoke to somebody whose family is to be, this person has CF. This person and their family are going to be tested, I believe, at Boston Children's, who I heard is developing their own antibody test because they are very concerned with all the inaccurate results. So that led me to question, and somebody else submitted the same question. We know they're collecting information about testing for COVID-19, but with all these tests for antibodies, is somebody consolidating that information?
Not really. As we mentioned, there's all these different tests available. So different investigators, research groups are using, one or more of these tests, but nobody is really merging them all into a single database. And that has resulted in some confusion, because when they do these so-called seroprevalence studies, that is looking at the number of people in a particular city or county or area who test positive, that number comes up different in different areas. So for, in LA, it's been 5% in the most recent study. In Boston, it's 10%. New York City, it's 20%. So who do you believe? Well, partly that could be the reality that there's different levels of exposure in different places. That makes perfect sense. But the assay accuracy also plays into those differences. So as I mentioned, the government is supposed to be looking to validate a number of these different tests. Until we have that out there in the public domain, it's going to be very hard to know and to pick a winner and to try and use that as the basis for sort of normalizing all the different studies that have been done.
Just seems like that's such a key thing to know in terms of numbers of who has been exposed, because we'll never capture it, right? If we're...
It's an odd situation, because when you think about the way the government regulates laboratories in general, they won't let a laboratory give a test results back unless it's CLIA certified, which means that they validated the testing that's being done in that laboratory. And here we are with this massive public health challenge, and it really is the Wild West, where basically anybody who has enough money can, have a little company put out a test kit and sell it on the internet or whatever, and people will use it, and then they may be making life or death decisions based on the result of that test. So until this all gets clarified, it's going to be difficult to know how to interpret the results.
A pharmaceutical company in Sorrento, California is claiming to have discovered an antibody, STI 1499, that could provide 100% inhibition of the coronavirus and be made available months before a vaccine hits the market. Can you please comment on any viability of this claim?
So there are a lot of different companies, as well as some academic labs, that are producing these antibodies. And what they do is take cells from people that have recovered, and they can detect and engineer antibodies that will recognize the virus. And this is one of the companies that's doing it. And we're at the stage now where several are anticipating getting into clinical trials. And this builds on the idea of using that convalescent plasma, where somebody who's recovered has these antibodies naturally in their blood. So you take their plasma, you give it to sick people, and it may help them recover. And there are studies of plasma now also. But cleaner than plasma is to actually manufacture the antibodies by biotechnology. So this company is one of a number that are doing it. I know of at least 3 others where these so-called human monoclonal antibodies against the virus are being produced. What they need to show is that these antibodies neutralize the virus. That is, they prevent the virus from infecting cells in a test tube, in a petri dish. And then beyond that, they need to show that they actually can prevent infection in an animal model. And then if those things look good, they can then do a clinical trial to give the antibodies to people who are either at risk or early in infection and see if it helps them. So some of those studies probably will be starting within the next couple of months. I think there's a lot of hope that this will be a short-term, maybe not a fix, but certainly an improvement in helping people fight off the infection and at least avoid the severe COVID and the ICU ventilator death scenario.
And can you clarify between just showing antibodies to something versus neutralizing antibodies?
Right. So the virus is attaching to cells, and it's a kind of lock and key and lock situation. And that's how the virus gets into the cell. So the antibody is kind of blocking that. It's kind of like you're sticking some gum in the lock so the key can't get in there. Antibodies do this on a very, very fine specificity. So you can make an antibody that misses the keyhole by a little bit. It'll still bind to that area, but it may not prevent the key from going into the lock. So the neutralizing antibody is the perfect one that hits that lock precisely and blocks it. And that needs to be looked at in this neutralization testing, either in the lab or in an animal model before considering it for human use. But it is proceeding, and it's a technology that's very widely employed now. And it's interesting, some of these antibodies have been derived from people that were never exposed to COVID. So, which is very interesting, which means that some people that had other coronaviruses, by chance, some of the antibodies that they made actually fit the lock because there is this cross-reactivity. So there was a paper that just came out about this week, which means that there's some hope that we can actually get these antibodies from people that haven't even been sick with COVID. So there's a variety of interesting aspects to it, but the main thing is the specificity should neutralize the virus, meaning it should prevent it from being able to get into a cell to reproduce itself.
Got it. Thank you. And I wonder, with China being ahead of us, and the whole question is, how long will these antibodies stay in people's systems, right? Is it a short-term thing or a long-term? Right. Are they learning anything from the earliest cases about whether antibodies are still present?
Yes, they're seeing that after about 3 weeks, and we see this now also from outside China studies. After about 3 weeks, most people have the IgG antibodies, and those are longer lasting than the IgM antibodies. And these IgG antibodies are lasting at least a month or two, as far out as we are right now. So, and basically looking back into other knowledge about antibody formation, IgG antibodies usually last at least several months and sometimes years. So there's a good amount of hope that these antibodies will be sufficient for at least several months, if not longer.
With growing evidence to show a link between COVID-19 and blood clotting, and new angiographic images showing the progression of ischemic strokes relating to COVID-19, is there anything to specifically watch for or anything preventative that can be done to avoid this risk for someone who tests positive for the virus?
Yes, I think there is. What we've learned is that, and this applies to people that are sick enough to get admitted to the hospital, where they're able to have blood testing done at least, a few times. There are some measurements you can make on things in the blood that give a warning sign for these clots. And one in particular is called the D-dimer, which is a product of the breakdown of fibrin, which is part of a clot. So when the clotting system gets activated, the fibrin is kind of the sticky material that forms the clot, which is normally used in wound healing. And the D-dimer comes off of that as that's broken down over time. So the D-dimer level will shoot up. And it's been noted that D-dimer is pretty predictive of severe COVID, and now people are tying it more closely to the actual issue that this person asked about, the thrombosis. So that's at least one biomarker, as we like to say. It's probably part of the process of how this forms that will give a way to check that over time. And that can help, along with other tests, to guide treatment. So more and more patients who are showing that, especially if they have any evidence of clots, for example, in the veins in the leg, they will be put on an anticoagulant, or other measures may be taken to try and reduce the possibility that they'll have a catastrophic clot like a pulmonary embolus, which has been found in many cases in patients that have died.
And with the feet, the COVID toes, is that a clotting issue to show those blisters, or is that an inflammation?
I'm not sure if that, it could be a clot issue, especially if they kind of turn purple and stay there for a while, but it could also be a sign of inflammation of the blood vessel. I'm not sure studies have actually looked at that. They'd have to do biopsies to really know that for sure. And I haven't seen that, but that's the supposition. It's one or both of those things going on there.
So if somebody did test positive for COVID-19, there really isn't anything to do except know that if they were to be ill enough to be at the doctor's, they would test for that measure to see if the clotting factor is
I think most hospitals now, part of their protocol for admitted patients is to be on the lookout for clotting problems, and things like the D-dimer and ultrasound of the veins in the leg. Those things are all easy to do and can provide early warning signals that this is happening. And many places are being more aggressive with anticoagulation as part of their overall management.
Hydroxychloroquine is still featured in the news. Is there any merit to using this as a preventative measure in safeguarding against COVID-19?
Well, I think the jury is actually still out on that. There's more information about the use of this in sick patients in the hospital or even critically ill patients. And that's where a lot of the safety concerns really are important because of drug-drug interactions, the fact that the sicker patients can already have some heart involvement, so they're more likely to have arrhythmia problems. And the safety of the drug is probably pretty good in people that are otherwise doing fairly well. But we don't know if it has any value as a prophylactic treatment. I do know that this is being studied and we're not going to get the answer right away. So this is going to still hang out there for a number of weeks to months. There's at least 3 studies that I know about, one in Detroit, which is looking, they want to enroll 3,000 people, healthcare workers and also first responders, and do a randomized trial of hydroxychloroquine to see if it helps in preventing the disease. There's one in India of contacts of people that have been diagnosed with COVID. And there's a study in Utah, which is looking at newly diagnosed patients with a positive test and their household contacts. So that specific area of use of hydroxychloroquine, to me, makes more sense than giving it to very sick people, because if it has an effect, its effect is going to be relatively weak and more likely to help very early in the course or prevention of the actual sort of progression of the disease. So I wouldn't necessarily poo-poo that, but we don't have any evidence that it's going to work in that group any better than it does in hospitalized or critically ill patients.
And I do hope that there's not a whole run that seemed to start in the beginning where people with lupus and other conditions that it is proven to treat them don't face shortages of that medication.
Yeah, with President Trump's announcement that he's been taking it for the last week or more, I think that again will produce another wave of demand. And that, of course, is unfortunate to especially the people that really need it for their lupus or or malaria or whatever other usage it's being used for.
Next question. Michael Ryan, the WHO's emergencies chief, stated that COVID-19 may become endemic and never go away. What evidence does the World Health Organization have to justify this statement?
Well, I think it's more of a concern, but as time goes on, concern than evidence, but as time goes on, it becomes more likely, because if you think about it, there's 2 ways it doesn't become endemic. One is that it's a seasonal virus, and we know other coronaviruses are seasonal. They're winter cold viruses and go away in the summer. That doesn't seem to be the case with this one because of experience already in very warm climates in places in the world like Singapore, Thailand, India, so on. So that's probably not true, but there may be some variability in terms of seasonal weather patterns. But more, I think he's talking more about the issue of the virus being so widespread that we cannot stamp it out. And how do you stamp out a virus like this? The only way you can do is to shut down human-to-human transmission. And that requires, at this point, with 5 million people infected, and many more probably who have not been tested, how do you get a handle on that worldwide? I think it's probably the cat is out of the bag and it's here to stay. So unless there's some seasonal variability, it's probably going to be endemic. and may get worse in the winter because of co-infections with flu and other winter viruses. So I think that was the concern being expressed there.
The World Health Organization annual oversight meeting was slated to begin this week. Is there any information available at this point as to what we can learn or gain from this event?
That's more of a political question, I think, at this point. I do know, just from reading the news, that the US is not only not participating, but is attacking the meeting in the World Health Organization. The Secretary of Health and Human Services, Alex Azar, attacked the meeting yesterday and attacked the World Health Organization as biased. And on the flip side, Xi Jinping, the leader of China, was at that meeting and basically very blatantly is trying to step into the role of that the US used to play, which is world leader, and offering money and distribution of equipment, vaccines, and things like that. So this is part of a political struggle between China and the United States that unfortunately has really contaminated what should be a straightforward public health issue. But man is a political animal and there's no way to get around it. So we'll see what happens over the long term. I do know that the president has threatened to extend the ban on funding of the World Health Organization from the United States indefinitely. So we don't know where that's going either.
How many COVID-19 strains are now known, and are the strains associated with particular regions, or are they all equally widespread?
Well, the strains are being tracked by molecular virologists, and there are at least 14 different strains that have been described where there are these minor differences in the genetic sequence and therefore in some of the proteins of the virus. So far, there's just one that's been identified. It's the major one outside of China, which may be more transmissible than the original one that was found in China. And there's been debate about that. I don't think it's a settled question among the experts. And I'm certainly not an expert in that area. And from my reading of what they say, most of these changes or mutations are not affecting the transmissibility or the virulence of the virus. But it is possible that this one strain, which some people call G614, may be more transmissible. And that is the one that seems to dominate outside of China. You see it more in Europe and the Americas than strains found in China.
And is there a difference between West Coast, East Coast in the United States for numbers? Do you know?
No, but I think people have shown the very rapid transmission from one coast to the other of the same strain, which simply reflects the way we have lived until now. You know, before the spring, people were getting on airplanes like crazy. I'm no exception, I'm sure you aren't, and taking whatever we have with us or in us from one coast to the other, right?
Yeah. So let's see, let's move to vaccinations. We have several questions related to vaccinations. Well, let's start with, can you provide us with an update on any noteworthy vaccination trials for COVID-19 and how likely, quote, the people's vaccine, which would be available worldwide, is? How likely is the people's vaccine to be available?
Well, there are 133 different vaccines being developed according to one aggregator. And at least six or seven have entered clinical trials. 3 of those are Chinese vaccines being tested in China. And the one that's made the most news here is the Moderna mRNA vaccine, which single-handedly lifted the stock market this week very substantially because of results in 8 people. But that's a very important thing because they showed that at least that approach, which is a brand new approach to vaccination, to actually give the genetic material, not the DNA, but the messenger RNA, to give that as the vaccine that fools the body into making the proteins that are then recognized by the immune system of that same body and make the antibodies to it. So these people, and these were 2 lower dose groups. They got a baseline shot and a second shot. And they produced as much antibody as people who have recovered from the disease. So that is very hopeful, and that was the reason for the wildly optimistic reaction of the investment community, not just in that company, but broadly across the whole stock market. It's way early to say whether this is going to pan out, but it is a hopeful sign. And it's the main one that's being tried in the States right now. Pfizer also has one in collaboration with another company. They've started testing here in the States as well as in Germany. And there's another company that makes a DNA-based vaccine. So a number of different attempts have been made. There's a group in England based in Oxford that's using a different approach with what they call a non-replicating viral vector. So that was what's carrying the message into the vaccinee. And they've already started their trials there also, which is a very good beginning. So we need a lot of shots on goal to see which one of these, and quite likely more than one, will be able to make it to the finish line. And then the question is going to be all the other issues that we mentioned before about how do you scale this up? Who gets the first doses? How much does it cost? Who's bearing that responsibility financially? Who is it that is actually coordinating this on a worldwide basis? World Health Organization. But again, we're loggerheads, at least the administration is with the World Health Organization. So it seems to me like we're going to have an America first approach to vaccination. Chinese may get there first, and who knows if they'll provide us with their vaccine. So this is going to be a very interesting question over the next 6 to 12 months. The timelines does seem to be accelerating a little bit. So they're really trying a crash program to at least get one or more of these into larger trials. And, the president has said we're going to have one by the end of this year. Most of the scientific community says that's not really feasible. We'll see what happens.
I'm impressed by the volunteers who are stepping up to be the first people to be injected, right, with this.
That's right. And one of the things you need to think about, for example, in the Moderna vaccine trial, these volunteers are between 18 and 55. And they're not really the main target group if you think about older folks. They are one of the main target groups in terms of healthcare workers, representing that age group. But we're also going to need to vaccinate older people, especially people in nursing homes, particularly, and other people that are over the age of 70 or maybe 65. And so the vaccine trials need to incorporate that demographic also. We don't have any data about that with this vaccine or any other one at this point.
Oh, that's an excellent point. And are any of the, I know why when you do a clinical trial, you want to keep these confines, but you think that with this, that would be a key part of who they'd want to test?
Well, I think the larger, especially the phase 3 trials, are going to do that. And one of the sidebar issues is the government of this country or any other country going to allow challenge studies to accelerate the development. That is, get volunteers to get the vaccine and then be challenged with SARS-CoV-2. We don't know the answer to that yet. There's a lot of debate about that among ethicists and the general public, in fact. And then the sidebar to the sidebar is, what are we going to do about the anti-vaxxer population? Because we need to, if the goal of this is to create herd immunity, you're going to need to vaccinate enough people to provide that. And that means, in various people's estimates, 60 to 80% of the population will need to accept the vaccine. And we have a very loud, vocal, anti-vax segment of our population, which is already making noises about this vaccine being a plot to take over the world for Bill Gates. So these are all issues that are going to be coming up in the next few months.
And it's going to be so challenging because so many of the vaccinations, we start young, so you can mandate at least if your child is in a public school, right? They have to have this. But this is something that impacts every member of society, every age. So what becomes the hook?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because the kids are the other side of that, the age equation, right? Is this a vaccine that's only going to be given to adults, or are we going to also immunize children? Do they need to be immunized? If they do, how early in life should they be immunized? Is their immune response similar, better or worse than it is in, let's say, the 18 to 55 group? All these questions need to be addressed.
can you explain the process of producing the vaccine for the seasonal flu? How effective is the seasonal influenza vaccination, and is this information useful in predicting and vaccinating for the emerging coronavirus strains?
So the first thing to say about that is how many in public health are very concerned about this upcoming flu season and how important it's going to be to get your flu vaccines. And obviously the CF community in general has been very good about its adherence rate to seasonal flu vaccines. This year, especially important because we expect it to complicate the COVID situation come October, November, December. So that's the first thing. How's it made? Well, the flu vaccine is grown in chicken eggs. The virus is, the strain that they think is going to be, or strains that they think are going to be most prevalent are put into these chicken eggs, and then it's extracted from that medium and inactivated. The virus is inactivated and then purified. So it's a inactivated, purified antigen from that culturing process. And that, of course, it involves a big industry to make as much as is needed. So how do they actually pick what's going to be in there? It changes every year because the flu is mutating every year. Different strains are dominating. And it's a really interesting process. There's all around the world, there are these centers that monitor what strains are out there. And they then provide this information to certain institutions that aggregate that information. And they pass it on to panels of experts who meet and choose their best guess as to what's going to be the dominant strain for that coming year. And for the Northern Hemisphere, that advisory group makes a decision in February, which is different from the Southern Hemisphere because of the different situation in the two hemispheres. They decide in September for the coming year. So it's an ongoing process that is there, that's been set in place for a long time now. And not every year do they choose the right strains, right? So in some years, the flu vaccine is quite effective. In other years, it's meh, and in other years, they just miss the mark completely. And this is leaving aside the pandemic flu strains that like avian flu and H1N1, those kind of ones that are more serious that come along every so often. So the whole flu situation is very complicated, but that's basically the process. Bottom line, get your flu shot.
Yeah.
Not this year.
It's so hard because there are years it's not as successful, and it just ends up reinforcing the people who proudly say they don't get their flu shot every year. So
there's a large number of people that do not take flu vaccines, and the most common thing I've heard, and this comes up even in our clinic, even in the CF clinic, is it gave me the flu last time I got the shot. I got the flu. Well, I had a reaction to the flu shot, but it wasn't the flu. And so people are put off by that. And I understand that, but the flu itself, people do die of the flu, especially if they're co-infected with SARS-CoV-2. So this is something to take very seriously.
Well, and I confess, I was one of those people when this all started in February, the talks about it, and I was thinking, it's so interesting that people are so worried about COVID-19 when half the people won't even get a flu shot. And I think we're up to 20,000 people dead already this year from the flu. So I was one of those people who didn't understand just how incredibly contagious this was and how virulent and how fatal for so many people. But that was my first reaction was, wow, people don't take 20 to 30,000 deaths a year seriously enough to get the flu shot and hope that it's the right one. So, which I think poses challenges as we move forward, coming back to the original thing, once we're fortunate enough to have a vaccine, how do we make sure people get it?
Right, and circling back to the vaccine question, we cannot rule out the chance that variants, mutations in COVID-2 will also require new vaccines periodically, just like the flu. So we don't know how simple or complex that whole vaccination issue is going to turn out to be ultimately.
And maybe I should have asked this one before, but what is the difference between viruses with current vaccinations, like the seasonal flu and measles, mumps, chickenpox? Have we seen any predictable behavior patterns in COVID-19 that could help lead us to achieving herd immunity?
Well, the The herd immunity issue is interesting because as I understand it, again, I'm not an epidemiologist, so I might get this wrong, but my understanding is that the achievement of herd immunity depends in part on how transmissible the virus is. So SARS-CoV-2, which causes COVID, is somewhere between the flu and measles. Measles is the most infectious one that has been described, with a so-called R0 of 18, which means one person can infect 18 other people. The figure for SARS-CoV-2, most people give is around 2 to 3. So it's definitely transmissible, but it's not the most transmissible or infectious of all the viruses out there. And the hope is that with a virus at this level of infectivity or transmissibility, if you get, and again, the figures that I've heard range from 50 to 80%, will achieve herd immunity, where it breaks up the chain as transmission because enough people are immune. But it's certainly over 50%. And right now, even the best antibody figures you can get in New York at 20% are well short of that. Most places in the world were down at 5% or lower. So we have a very long way to go. And that's why people need to really be realistic about the fact that the virus is not going to disappear, despite what some people say. It's here to stay. Real issue is, when are we going to get immune? And whether it's 50% or 80%, whether it's through natural infection or the vaccine, we need to get there to make this whole thing go away. Mm-hmm. That's the basic truth of it.
Yeah. Let's see. We already talked about consolidating information about antibody testing. Which states have completely reopened? And I understand you wouldn't possibly have a list of every state in the country, but the states that have completely reopened, do you know if there are second waves of COVID-19 occurring? Are there any success stories in keeping the curve flat in areas that are completely reopened? How long does it take to see a hotspot or an outbreak? When you hear about these super infectors at like a wedding or a party, how long does it take to track that? And
well, there's at least a 2-week lag between an infection and the ability to really get some hard data, at least 2 weeks. So that's the minimum. So we're always looking back, in time. And what's happening now, it'll take us 2 weeks in the future to really know what's happening. So this is a week when many states are relaxing. And when I would make a point of acknowledging that it's not all open or all closed down. It's not, shelter in place versus everything like it used to be. People are not going back to the stadium for the ball game, and they're not going to concerts and so on. So the states in general are taking reasonable actions to go step by step and start with things that are easiest to do and keep in place the measures that are most important, which include the public masking, the 6-foot rule, the hand hygiene, those sorts of things. Having said that, it is important to see what the trends are, because there are differences between states and counties and locales in terms of how quickly they're going. And some places never did do a shelter in place. They never did a full lockdown. So you're starting from a different starting point, and the pace is different in different places. What I would recommend to folks is to go to the New York Times website, which is free. And on their front page, they have a little box that says world cases, US cases. And when you go into US cases, you can pick out your state. Within your state, you can pick out your county. And then they have very, very nice graphs that show curves for new cases, hospitalizations, and deaths. And what you really want to see is that downward slope. And ideally, you want to see that for over a 2-week period as sort of green light to go to the next level. So that is a relatively easy way to check this out wherever you're living and see where your state or your county or your city is.
Great. And I would say, regardless of what's happening in your community, keep doing those things that Dr. Moss just said. The mask, the gloves, the hand hygiene, the 6 feet.
Yeah, it's going to get harder because I think there's going to be more rather than less political discord about this, and people not giving other people the benefit of the doubt on either side of the equation. And certainly we've seen a lot of that already, and my guess is it's going to be more acute as we get closer to the election in the fall.
The last question submitted, I'm worried about all the loss of jobs and subsequent health insurance coverage with the disease as devastating and as expensive as CF. Together with the threat of inflation, do you see any areas of particular devastation in the financial management of our CF care, such as the loss of Trikafta or other expensive treatments and therapies that we depend on?
I don't see it in the availability of CF medications at this point, with the possible exception of albuterol. We talked about that. It's a drug that's not specifically for CF, but is used a lot, and there are shortages reported. The FDA does have that comprehensive list of shortages on, and there's a website that they have on that. I would point to other things. If someone's been furloughed or lost their job and their health insurance is through their employer, that's a potential problem, right? That's a big problem for a lot of people, millions and millions of people. And I see that affecting at least some families with CF also. The second is the coverage through Medicaid, through public payers, going to be maintained as financial pressure exists on the government as well as on corporations and businesses. So they may lose particular coverage. It may have increased copays or increased deductibles, things like that to deal with, even if they're not losing their employer health insurance. And then finally, shortages themselves, which I think are the least likely, but and as far as I know, that's not a danger for Trikafta or other modulators, or for DNase or for Toby or other things that are specific for CF. So I think the medications will be there. The issue is going to be, what's the financial situation of that family going to be, especially if we don't get adequate, government help. Most people have already burned through their initial, $1,200. So we'll see how people fare. But I'm worried about that. I think everyone needs to be. This is a question for the entire country.
So that is the end of the list submitted this week. I thank everybody who did submit their questions for Dr. Moss, and we are so grateful to you, Dr. Moss, for once again sharing your time and your expertise with us. And do you have any parting words for us?
Yeah, the questions are getting harder every week, and I'm going to have to quit at some point because they're going to be beyond my capabilities, but trying to hang in there.
So we believe in you, and we're grateful. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.